Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really big issue, something that's affecting, well, pretty much the whole economy. How these unpredictable trade policies are hitting the trucking and logistics industries.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got some analysis here that digs into how all this volatility is, forcing some major changes in how companies manage their people and where they put their money.
It's crucial stuff if you're someone keen on understanding, like, how goods actually move around, how supply chains work.
Or just the real world fallout from those big global policy decisions you read about.
Exactly. Then this deep dive is definitely for you. We're seeing some pretty fundamental shifts happening right now.
We really are.
Think about those headlines, tariffs this, trade talks that. This is about their actual effects, like
Mm-hmm.
why did my package take longer? Or why are some things suddenly more expensive?
Mm-hmm. A lot of it traces back to this uncertainty.
So our goal today is to unpack how this whole trade policy roller coaster impacts everyone. From, the drivers out there on the road,
To the companies deciding whether to make big long-term investments.
and even the warehouses storing all the goods. We'll look at the global angle too, and how businesses are trying to cope with this new normal.
And it's worth saying, I think, that the logistics world, they're used to ups and downs, right? Demand fluctuates.
Yeah.
But this kind of unpredictability, the stuff driven by constantly changing trade rules, tariffs,
Mm.
that's a different beast. It's a whole other layer of instability.
Okay, so let's jump right into that core issue then. The trade policy uncertainty itself. The analysis we looked at, it really highlights how these constant shifts, tariffs, import-export rules, trade deals are just causing major headaches.
Yeah, and what's kind of striking is how fast and how broad the impact is. These policies, they might have some larger strategic goal behind them,
Right.
but for industries like trucking, the effect is direct and, well, pretty immediate. A new tariff pops up and bam, the amount of freight moving can change like almost overnight.
That's the first big domino, isn't it? Forecasting. How can you possibly plan?
How do you plan?
When the basic rules of global trade feel like they're written in sand. The report mentioned this whipsaw effect. A tariff hike means freight drops off sharply.
Uh-huh.
Then, if it gets eased, suddenly there's this mad scramble to catch up with all the pent-up demand. Sounds like a nightmare for logistics folks.
It really is. And this isn't just, numbers on a spreadsheet. Think about a trucking company trying to figure out, okay, how many drivers do we need? Or what are the best routes?
Yeah.
If they can't predict volume accurately, they're always just reacting, not planning ahead, which leads us straight into these workforce shifts we're seeing.
This part really jumped out at me from the analysis. You've got big names, Stellantis, Cleveland Cliffs, making production changes, even layoffs.
Right.
And they're specifically pointing to these unpredictable tariffs as a reason.
Huh.
And for trucking itself, they're moving the goods, so the impact must be even more direct.
Oh, absolutely. Trucking is right there at the sharp end. There was a quote in the analysis from a regional operations manager
I remember that one.
that really captured it. Something like, when freight dries up, we park trucks, rethink staffing, but when tariffs lift, it's a mad dash to ramp back up.
Wow. That really paints a picture.
That's the reality for these companies and for their drivers.
So it means a lot of instability for the actual people doing the work, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The analysis pointed to this trend. More carriers relying on temporary drivers, flexible staffing models.
Exactly. That's becoming more common. Now, for the companies, okay, it gives them some short-term flexibility, it lets them scale up or down faster.
But for the drivers, probably means less job security, right? More income volatility.
Definitely. Less security, less predictable income.
Yeah.
And relying more on a temporary workforce, well, that can have knock-on effects too.
Like what?
Well, potentially impacting driver retention, maybe the overall experience level out on the roads, even things like safety standards if there's constant churn. It just adds up to a less stable labor situation overall.
Okay, so with all that uncertainty floating around, it's probably no shock that businesses are getting, well, cautious about making big long-term investments.
Yeah, you can see why.
The analysis showed a noticeable slowdown in capital spending and logistics, especially, it seems, in markets where policy feels riskier.
Which brings up a really critical question, doesn't it? If companies are hesitant, say, to upgrade their fleets to more fuel-efficient trucks,
Or expand warehouses.
or adopt new tech like automation or better route software, what does that mean long-term for the industry's efficiency, for its growth?
That's a huge point. There was that Time report suggesting the pace of adopting these efficiency-boosting technologies is actually slowing down?
Slowing down.
Yeah, because companies just aren't confident they'll get a return on investment in this climate.
Right.
Feels like a catch-22 almost.
It really does. You need to invest to become more resilient, but the uncertainty itself stops you from investing.
Precisely.
And this hesitation, it's not just about the big physical assets like trucks and warehouses. It ripples out, right? Contributes to the supply chain disruptions we keep hearing about.
Yeah, like delays at ports.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Port delays, shipping times all over the place, the extra hassle and cost of having to constantly reroute cargo, that becomes the day-to-day operational headache.
And again, it's the truckers often dealing with that directly, isn't it? Facing unpredictable schedules, more late arrivals, and those expensive empty miles when a load gets canceled or rerouted.
Yeah.
All that eats into their profits, drives up costs. It's just one challenge after another.
It's a cascade, yeah. And if you pull back the lens even further, this trade volatility, it even seeps into areas like warehousing and industrial real estate.
Right, because if the flow of goods is choppy,
Then the demand for storage space in those key logistics hubs gets choppy too.
the analysis specifically mentioned places like Los Angeles and Savannah, these big coastal hubs.
Yeah.
Seeing warehouse occupancy rates dip when international trade slowed down. That's a really clear example of how these high-level policies hit local markets, local real estate.
It's just fascinating how interconnected it all is. A tariff changes on, I don't know, imported widgets.
Right.
And suddenly a trucker in the Midwest has less work, which then maybe means less demand for warehouse space near a port hundreds of miles away. It's a whole web.
And this isn't just a U.S. thing, is it?
Yeah.
The analysis made that pretty clear. These uncertainties have global consequences.
Oh, definitely global. We're seeing things like foreign direct investment dropping in some places. Nigeria was mentioned as an example, partly because the global trade policy environment is just so unpredictable right now.
So for those big multinational logistics companies, it must be a constant strategic puzzle.
Absolutely. They're always reevaluating. Where do we source from? Who are our partners? How do we even structure our global routes when the rules keep shifting?
Which leads naturally to this idea of nearshoring, right? Companies thinking, maybe we should make stuff closer to where we sell it.
That's gaining traction, yeah.
The analysis suggests that could mean more demand for domestic trucking down the road.
Could, yeah, long term.
But the timing, the scale, still pretty uncertain. It just shows how these big policy shifts create challenges, but also maybe new opportunities, just
Yeah.
with a lot of fog around them.
And that fog, that underlying uncertainty, that's really the core problem, isn't it? Businesses just can't make solid long-term plans when the ground keeps shifting underneath them.
So the million-dollar question then, faced with all this volatility, what are companies actually doing? How are they trying to navigate this new normal?
Well, the analysis laid out a few key strategies they're adopting. Makes sense, really.
Okay.
First one is pretty fundamental. Diversifying revenue. Basically, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right. Don't rely too much on one industry or one region.
Exactly. If one area gets hit by a trade policy change, hopefully your other business streams can cushion the blow. It's a classic risk management, really.
Makes sense. What else, Sam?
Building more agile supply chains. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Investing in tech, adaptable routing, dispatch systems, anything that lets you adjust quickly when freight volumes bounce around or customer needs change.
Being nimble, responsive.
Agility is key in this environment. If you can reroute quickly, adjust schedules, keep communicating when things go sideways, that's a real competitive edge.
Okay, diversifying, agility. Anything else stand out?
Yeah, this idea of investing in modular infrastructure, think flexible warehousing, maybe terminal expansions you can scale up or down easily.
So avoiding those huge fixed investments that could become dead weight if trade patterns shift again.
Precisely. It's a smarter way to manage capital spending when the future feels so uncertain. More adaptable, scalable solutions.
Smart. And finally,
Engaging in policy dialogue. Getting involved, working with industry associations, advocacy groups, making sure policymakers actually hear the industry's perspective, its concerns.
so being part of the conversation.
Absolutely. The trucking and logistics sector has a huge stake in stable, predictable trade policies. So being active in that political and regulatory space is, well, it's become a critical part of navigating the uncertainty.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Key takeaways from our deep dive today. We've really seen how this volatile trade policy era is throwing up some serious roadblocks for trucking and logistics.
Yeah, big time. Like major problems with forecasting demand.
Right, forecasting is a mess. Then there's the workforce instability companies constantly adjusting staffing.
Which flows from those policy shifts
Right.
and that reluctance to make those big long-term capital investments, especially in things like efficiency tech.
Exactly. And we also talked about the ripple effects, right? The actual supply chain disruption
Uh-huh. Putting real operational strain on truckers.
and creating volatility in related areas, like warehousing, especially in those key port cities.
And it's definitely not just a domestic issue. We saw the global impacts affecting foreign investment, pushing multinationals to rethink their entire supply chain setup.
With things like nearshoring maybe becoming more common as a result.
But, and this is important, the industry isn't just sitting back and taking it.
No, definitely not.
Companies are adapting. We talked about those strategies, diversifying revenue,
Building those more agile, flexible supply chain,
investing smarter with modular infrastructure.
and getting involved in policy discussions, trying to shape things.
That's right. And just to hammer home the real-world feel of this, I keep thinking about that operations manager quote you mentioned earlier.
The drying up and mad dash one.
Yeah. Freight volumes drying up, then the mad dash to ramp back up. That just perfectly captures the kind of instability these policy shifts are creating day to day.
It really does. So for you listening, someone who wants to understand the forces shaping our world, how our economy actually functions.
We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture, a better sense of how those high-level trade policies translate into very real consequences for how goods move and for the industries that make it happen.
Definitely. So, maybe a final thought to chew on. Given how interconnected global trade is now, and let's face it, the chance that policy shifts will keep happening,
Seems likely.
what kind of really fundamental, maybe long-term innovations or even transformative changes might be needed for trucking and logistics to not just cope, but to really thrive in what might just be a permanently uncertain global environment?
That's a big question. Makes you think about everything from, I don't know, widespread automation to totally new ways of organizing supply chains.
A lot to think about, for sure.
It certainly is plenty to keep an eye on as this all continues to unfold.